This episode is brought to you by LifeLock. It's tax season, and we're all a bit tired of numbers. But here's one you need to hear. $16.5 billion. That's how much the IRS flagged for possible identity fraud last year. Now here's a good number. 100 million. That's how many data points LifeLock monitors every second. If your identity is stolen, they'll fix it. Guaranteed. Save up to 40% your first year at LifeLock.com/podcast. Terms apply.
Hello, I'm Simon Brew. I'm the editor of Film Stories magazine, and a very warm welcome to the Film Stories podcast.
Come with me.
And I show you how deep the rabbit hole goes.
And movies that had stories.
That the story just sucks them in.
This is just the beginning.
Stories. We would be honored if you would join us.
Hello and a very warm welcome to Film Stories with Simon Brew. I am Simon Brew. As always, that's absolutely everything you need to know about me. The podcast, well, we're here, as the title suggests, to talk of the stories of films. And what I tend to talk about in the podcast are things like production stories, development stories, release stories. I look for the tales in and around movies that go towards making the films that we know and sometimes love. Just that, the films that we know and sometimes love. I don't really do snark, I'd say, I'm afraid, but I'm quite happy I don't do snark. I do tend to choose relatively mainstream films for the podcast and ones that I have some interest or investment in. Unusually though, one of the two films I'm talking about in this episode of Film Stories I really don't like very much at all, but that's not where my focus is going to be, because I think the story behind that movie in particular is an interesting one, and it's a story that's actually leading to a film that's coming out later this very month that this podcast is being recorded. So let me take you back to 2015. Here's a snippet of the trailer for Terminator Genisys.
My whole life I prepared my son to lead humanity in the fight against the machines.
On this night, we take back our world!
But there was one thing I could never prepare him for.
The machines tried to rig the game. Send a Terminator back to the time before the war to kill my mother.
I'll go back. Let me save her.
That then was a clip from Terminator Genisys, the 2015 Terminator sequel, directed by Alan Taylor, written this one by Later Calligridis and Patrick Lussier. The cast were led by Arnold Schwarzenegger, Jason Clarke, Emilia Clarke, Jai Courtney, Matt Smith's in there, J.K. Simmons in there, Courtney B. Vance is in there as well. And it's a bit of a muddled story, really, how this one came to be. It's a relevant one as well, too, considering the news stories that have broken just around the time this podcast is being recorded again, of potential reverting of the copyright for the Terminator franchise to producer Galen Hurd, and in turn to James Cameron, that he would, the creator of the franchise, would finally be able to have utter creative control back over it. But the roots of Terminator Genisys actually lie in 2009's Terminator Salvation. That was the McG directed film released by Sony in the end, that was effectively doing a reboot of the Terminator franchise and seeing really if it could carry on without Arnold Schwarzenegger in the lead role. Not for the first or the last time. The idea was it would lead to sequels. I've previously done a podcast on Terminator 3 Rise of the Machines, and there were supposed to be sequels to that, but the ambition was clear with Terminator Salvation, that what they wanted to do was kickstart a new trilogy of Terminator films. As such, in came Christian Bale and Sam Worthington to take on the lead roles, and that you get very minimal CG Arnold Schwarzenegger in the film, not least because he was away doing politics at the time. Terminator Salvation wasn't a box office disaster, but neither was it the absolute breakout hit that all concerned were looking for. It cost $200 million to make, and it returned $370 million in cinemas, obviously made more back once it got to DVD and Blu-ray and sorted other ways of making cash. But the problem was, one of the companies, the rights holders behind the Terminator and the rights of the Terminator, we've explored it in Film Stories magazine actually in a recent issue, but the rights of the Terminator franchise have bounced around pretty much more than any other major franchise in Hollywood. They'd end up with a company called the Halcyon Company, and even in the run-up to Terminator Salvation's release, there was toing and froing over legalities with the people who oversaw, the ultimate owners of the Halcyon Company, were involved in legal action against investors who they made allegations of pushed them into making bad business decisions, and this was all blowing up even before Salvation was released. And they paid $30 million to get the rights to Terminator to be able to make Salvation. And when that film was ultimately released in June of 2009, the box office wasn't enough to save the Halcyon Company. And in August of 2009, it filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy protection in the US. And once it had had a look at its assets book, they realised, well, we're going to have to put the rights for the Terminator back up for auction. And that thus, at the start of February 2010, such a deal was done. This killed Terminator Salvation 2 stone dead at this point. That the Terminator name was going on to completely different rights holders, and the strong suggestion, well, the inevitability was they were going to start again. It's worth noting too that when they did initially snap up those rights for $30 million, they beat out a deal from Sony and Lionsgate for $35 million for the rights, and the name of Lionsgate is going to come back up shortly. In February 2010 then, a hedge fund by the name of Pacificor picked up the rights for the Terminator for just shy of $30 million, which is some way shy too of the $70 million valuation that was being bandied around when the Halcyon Company first said they were going to put those rights up for sale. But for Pacificor, well, they had no intention of making the film by the looks of it. It was a straight business decision, because 4 months later it retained the William Morris Endeavour agency to sell on those rights again. And for William Morris, this was a good deal because it meant it could package its creative talent too towards putting a new Terminator film together. But it wasn't really, this was not a quick process. So basically all of 2010 was wiped out by this, and it wasn't until May 2011 that those rights would ultimately be sold on again. Once again, Lionsgate was in the running for them. In fact, Lionsgate was in pole position and was expected to snap up the rights for the Terminator. Its coffers were swollen off the back of its success with the Hunger Games movies. Again, I've talked about those in a previous Film Stories episode. And it had its checkbook out. But in came producer Megan Ellison's Annapurna Films, and Annapurna had been making some really quality high-end fare. It wasn't really going for the heavy blockbuster market at this point. And to give you some context of what Megan Ellison was up to at the time, she was putting together the funding for the Hurt Locker at the point that this Terminator auction was taking place. Annapurna came in with a late bid, and that late bid was rumoured to be around $20 million in the end, because the price was dropping. And the reason the price was dropping were copyright fears, copyright law really, that the domestic US rights to the Terminator were due to revert back to James Cameron in 2019, given that it was 35 years since the original Terminator film. And this is what's come up again, that is now allowing original rights holders to reapply for the copyright for their films after a period of 35 years. Now, at the point the news was announced that Annapurna had snapped up the rights to the Terminator, it was very much, this is going to be another film, that they were going to start again from scratch. And at this point, Arnold Schwarzenegger, well, his role of governor of California had come to an end, and he confirmed he was going to return to make the movie. He was going to star in this one, and at this point Justin Lin was due to direct. But still, there was a lot of time that went by before things could really get moving. And so in the end, Justin Lin would drop out of making what was then Terminator 5 to make Fast and Furious 6 instead. But he specifically held open the door, the possibility of returning for Terminator 6 should the fifth film work out. Well, Lin eventually went on to do a couple more Fast and Furious films. He's back making another one now, and did Star Trek Beyond. He's not been near a Terminator film since. There were fears from fans of the Terminator series following Terminator Salvation as to whether this whole thing was going to be treated properly, though. Salvation came in for criticism for a couple of reasons. Number one, it was clearly divested from James Cameron's brain, that he'd had no involvement in this one and he was basically an audience member. Number two, it had gone for a PG-13 rating in the US, the first Terminator film to actively do so, and that had caused real fan pushback, that there was a very strong feeling that a Terminator film in the US should be R-rated. These weren't family movies. These weren't trying to get to the stereotypical 4-quadrant appeal to absolutely everybody. Terminator had started off as hard-edged science fiction, and the softening of it had only happened really in recent times. Terminator 2 didn't really dumb down, did it? It played for an older audience. Terminator Salvation tried to have its metaphorical cake and tried to metaphorically eat it as well. And even though it made a bit of money, that didn't go well. So Megan Ellison tweeted actually in January 2012 in a response to the Terminator fans' Twitter account, and there hadn't been much news at this point, it should be clear. It had been 6-7 months since she picked up the rights, but she wrote on her Twitter feed, "We can't really tell you guys anything about Terminator, but it will be an R-rated film as God and James Cameron intended." It was clear at this point that Ellison was trying to do the right thing. She met several times with James Cameron, in fact, to get his input, to get him slightly back involved. Even though Cameron wasn't going to make the film or write the film or produce the film or direct the film, she wanted to, there was a feeling they wanted to have more of his blessing than Salvation had ever got. Ultimately, the deal that got Annapurna the rights, however, wouldn't be concluded until December 2012. So this had gone on another 18 months or so. When it was done, it was announced that the deal would cover at least 2 films, and it was all wrapped up at the end of 2012. Ellison brought in her brother's company, David Ellison. He ran Skydance, and they decided to partner on the films, and they needed a studio partner as well. Well, Skydance had an existing relationship with Paramount Pictures, so Paramount agreed to buy in as well. And finally, with everything in place, that Terminator 5 was finally announced in the June of 2013. We were told at that point it was going to be a part of a brand new trilogy. The first of those films would land in June of 2015. And at this point, there were screenwriters involved as well. And that's later Calagridis and Patrick Lussier, who turned the job down, as it turned out, 3 times before they ultimately took it on, because they could see a poison chalice coming a mile off. They were Terminator fans. They didn't particularly they weren't particularly enamoured with the idea of just going into this no man's land of trying to come up with a new Terminator film that would satiate what was required from a business point of view, but also keep Terminator fans happy. And also, they didn't really want to go back against James Cameron. They had huge respect for him. They'd separately got were enjoying successful screenwriting careers. Calagridis had worked with Cameron on Avatar. Lussier had penned Drive Angry. Remember that? The Nick Cage one, Drive Angry 3D. But they met with James Cameron. They had a conversation with him, and it was him ultimately who persuaded them to take on the job. And duly they did, and they mapped out the trilogy that would begin with Terminator 5. In theory then, by the middle of 2013, it was full steam ahead, with the slight caveat that a replacement for director Justin Lin hadn't been hired at that point. I mean, it was clear McGee wasn't going to come back after Terminator Salvation, and the top choice for Terminator 5 at that stage was Ang Lee. But as Variety reported back in 2013, ultimately no deal could be reached with Ang Lee, and he didn't take the job on. Who else was on the list? Well, interestingly, some really good sci-fi names. Rian Johnson was on there off the back of Looper. There was Denis Villeneuve was on the list as well. But ultimately, off the back of his Game of Thrones work and reports at the time that Thor: The Dark World was going well, it was Alan Taylor who landed the job, and this would be Taylor's second blockbuster back to back, because he was working on Thor: The Dark World. Again, I've covered that in an earlier Film Stories podcast and all the directorial issues on that. But in September 2013, just a month or two before his Thor sequel was going to be released, it was announced that Alan Taylor was the director. Terminator 5 was going ahead. Schwarzenegger very much on board. He'd been on board from the start. He was going to get quite rich off the back of this film because he was short of a few quid. The roles of Carl Reese, John Connor and Sarah Connor were crucial to the project working, and this goes back to what all concerned were trying to do, which was really pay proper respect to the first and second Terminator films, to the point of ignoring the films that therefore followed. And they knew, as part and parcel of that, because the screenplay was going to weave in elements of the first Terminator film, that they needed to recast those roles. They needed to recast John Connor, Sarah Connor, Carl Reese. So in the role of Carl Reese, which was the last of those three to be cast, Garrett Hedlund and Tom Hardy were reported to be possible considerations. It was Jai Courtney in the end who took that on. Sarah Connor, or Tatiana Maslany and Brie Larson were on the shortlist for that one, but it was Emilia Clarke who took the job on in the end, and Jason Clarke landed the role of John Connor. It's worth noting as well that even though the cast was pretty much in place by February 2014, as was the director, Matt Smith was added in the spring of last year with the tease that he was going to have a major role in the forthcoming trilogy, although a smaller role in the first of that trilogy. J.K. Simmons too was added around this time. Now, filming finally began in April 2014. So this we're what, about three years after the rights had first changed hands, three and a half years, and all concerned were desperately trying to honour those Terminator films. Stories were coming out during the production of how they were trying to go back to the start and weave everything in. In fact, the writers gave an interview where they talked about, because there were so many time travel elements they were trying to weave in, of having whiteboards on the office, on their across the walls of their office that were absolutely crammed with all the threads to try and get them into some kind of order. Now, interestingly, because of the labyrinthine rights situation with the Terminator film, what they couldn't do was use footage from the first movie, and what they wanted to do with Terminator 5 was to weave their story into the narrative of that Terminator film, to the point where they needed material from that film, but because of the rights issue they had to recreate it. And not necessarily out of choice, although director Alan Taylor said it would have looked unconvincing if they'd have just got the original film and used material from that. But it wasn't even an issue, because of the way the rights have all divvied up over time, that they had no choice. They had to do it this way. The production went on for 4 or 5 months. It came to the main bulk of production. Principal photography was done by the end of August 2014, and that's the point where the title was announced. No longer was this Terminator 5. It was officially Terminator Genisys with a Y in the name, which kind of raised a collective WTF from fandom at the time. One that wasn't massively answered when the film came out, in truth. We were told that the spelling error was deliberate and it tied into something in the film, and that wasn't a lie. That's absolutely true. I don't want to spoil the film if you're tempted to give it a try, but there is relevance to the way they spell Genesis in there. I know it's a very good relevance, but nonetheless it is a relevance. What I found particularly interesting, though, from this point onwards, was the way that the film was promoted, because it was almost as if they appreciated they were up against some degree of fan backlash, that the reveal of the name hadn't gone well at all. And even when trailers came out, there wasn't really the enthusiasm that they were hoping for. And this had been an expensive project to put together, that even just acquiring the rights to this film, remember, had cost a lot of money, and to actually the actual physical production of the movie, that was going to cost about $150 million as well. So they needed this to work, and they needed the first film to work in order to press ahead with the sequels, which is where the upside, the financial upside, would theoretically really kick in. They threw everything at the marketing, and as a consequence of that, to the point where they threw too much at it. I mean, it really was one of those cases of the marketing over-egging things a little, I think. And in particular, There was a point in 2015, a few months before they released the film, where a trailer came out that revealed a key spoiler, a huge spoilery moment in the movie. And we've seen this done before. I remember the trailers for How to Train Your Dragon 2 did this a bit as well. But it was just such a twist for the franchise, and they gave it away in the promotion. And Alan Taylor, for one, was not happy, and the director, even at the time of the film's release, told Uproxx in an interview that he wasn't happy. He said, quote, "I certainly directed those scenes with the intention that no one would know, and there was reportedly quite a lot of discussion behind the scenes over releasing such a key moment in the promotion. I would argue it backfired." Nonetheless, they had another marketing weapon up their sleeve, and that was James Cameron. They had him back on side, and they released this really odd featurette of James Cameron giving his reaction to seeing an early screening of Terminator Genisys that they put on for him. And this was all really part of keeping James Cameron and getting him back within the Terminator circle, as it were. And he says at the start of this featurette, and it's still available online, about how he didn't write it, didn't produce it, wasn't involved with it. So he was, quote, a fanboy. He sat down as a fanboy to watch the film. And he gave this really enthusiastic review of the film that killed his, I think it was the Shiznit on Twitter who said at the time, he killed his career as a film critic from the off, where he talked about, quote, how it reinvigorated the series. He said, "This is a renaissance," and he called it the third film in the series. He couldn't have given it a firmer backing had he tried. He was a huge supporter of the movie, and I mean, that really was, in fairness to Paramount, that was what fans wanted to hear. They wanted to hear that James Cameron endorsed this film, that James Cameron thought it was a good idea. And the problem was, when it came out, it was clear that, let's just say, most people disagreed with James Cameron's opinion. That I remember going to a press screening of it and watching this film, and it just didn't work. For my money, it fell apart inside 20 minutes and then just had nothing left in the tank. But it would be remiss to say it failed. That whilst critically it was hit very hard and not many people warmed to it, this is the second highest grossing Terminator film. That it made over $400 million worldwide, and appreciating the financial goals have changed an awful lot since even the huge success of Terminator 2 in 1991, $400 million in 1991, huge amount of money. $400 million in 2015 is pretty much a franchise killer, as we're about to see. Because even though a release date of June the 29th, 2018 had been announced for the second film, we had a bit of a Planet of the Apes moment here, and by that I mean the Tim Burton directed version of Planet of the Apes, where even though the box office tallied up, although not in the US for Terminator Genisys, it fell short of $100 million there. But even though the box office overall tallied up and it made over 400 million worldwide, the fan backlash, as it was with Burton's Planet of the Apes, was so that the studio just lost the confidence in pressing ahead with another chapter. And in fact, the bit that finally ended the chances of Terminator Genisys 2 was apparently the Chinese box office, that towards the end of 2015, the film came out in China. And it needed to clear, this is as per a Deadline report, it needed to clear $150 million at the Chinese box office to trigger the next film in the series, and it took 112 million. And the fact that its financial, it hadn't cleared $500 million worldwide, which I guess is what they were going for, and the fact that it had fallen short financially and the fans hadn't warmed to it really was the death knell for this particular Terminator trilogy. I should note as well, for all of what Megan Ellison said right at the start, it also came out with that PG-13 rating, and appreciating there's a fair amount you can get away with within a PG-13, it did feel like it ultimately Terminator Genisys had gone against what had been promised to fandom in more than one sense, really. There was a post-credits or a mid-credit sequence in Terminator Genisys which expanded on where the film was going to go next, and the trilogy was mapped out. They knew exactly where it was going to end, but the plug was pulled. And whilst the same producers are involved, the decision was made they're going to go for a new trilogy of Terminator films. So in fact, that's what comes along at the end of October in the UK, early November in the US. This has been recorded the start of October 2019. And Terminator Dark Fate is coming out. And interestingly, this is the one where they really have got James Cameron fully back on board, that they realised that's the way they needed to go, that Linda Hamilton is back as Sarah Connor, and basically they're ignoring every film after the second one again. So that's not the first time they've done that. It's the third straight attempt to launch a new trilogy of Terminator films. That is the plan, although a spanner may be thrown into that by the developing copyright situation. But with Terminator Genisys, it felt like a film story that started with a business decision and ultimately ended with a business decision as well, without a great film in the midst of it. Which brings me to the halfway point of this latest episode of Film Stories. If I could, first of all, can I just thank everyone who's responded to my forlorn pleas to subscribe to this podcast and leave really nice reviews for it, assuming you really like it. It helps enormously. I'm just an independent in a room recording this, and the amount of people who've done that recently, well, it really, really helps, and it really, really helps, gives this podcast exposure. And if you've not done that and you wouldn't mind, please do subscribe. Please do leave a review. Likewise, we also do Film Stories print magazine. You can find out more about that at filmstories.co.uk. At the point that this is being recorded, we're just about to send another issue to print, and you'll be able to find out more details of that on the website very, very shortly. And with that, let's just crack on with the second of the two films I'm going to talk about this in this episode, and this is one I absolutely love. Going back to 2002, just going to play you a clip, and I'll come to the story the other side of this.
We came to America because we had to get away from things. The Irish built Manhattan, so my dad says.
Is that our building?
You gonna live with kids in this building?
Is this a haunted house?
It's a magic house.
No monsters, no ghosts, no nightmares, no witches. No people coming into the kitchen, smashing the dishes. Mom, Dad, Christy and Ariel, all together in one happy family.
That then was a snippet from 2002's In America, directed by Jim Sheridan, written by Jim Sheridan, Naomi Sheridan and Kirsten Sheridan, with a cast led by Paddy Considine, Samantha Morton, Shimon Hansu, Emma Bolger and Sarah Bolger. And it's a really exceptional film, I think. But it's an exceptional film that's steeped very deeply in the life of its director and co-writer Jim Sheridan, and in the lives of his daughters, who also co-wrote the film, and that would be Naomi and Kirsten Sheridan, who've gone on to have and continue to have really interesting film careers as well. Jim Sheridan himself came to prominence as a filmmaker off the back of a pair of films he made in Ireland. My Left Foot, which won Daniel Day-Lewis the first of his 94 Best Actor Oscars, and The Field, starring the late Richard Harris. And he also went on and did In the Name of the Father. He did The Boxer, and his films regularly were ratcheting up Oscar nominations and critical acclaim, and some really good box office as well in some of those cases as well. But the most personal of his films remains In America, and it started, he's effectively a semi-autobiographical tale of his own journey when he moved his family, when his daughters were young, from Ireland to New York. Well, they went through Canada first, but then in early 80s they emigrated to America from Ireland before Sheridan would ultimately come back to Ireland to make films. And when he'd made some of these films and made successes of them, he came back to this tale portrayal. He wanted to bring to the screen what it was like to be an Irish immigrant in America, because he saw for many ups and downs lots of kindness and lots of kinship during that time, and that was kind of what he wanted to pour into a movie. But this was not a film that was going to come together particularly quickly for him. Not least because he wasn't, after he'd wrapped up on 1998's The Boxer, starring Daniel Day-Lewis, he wasn't in a rush to direct anything again. It's not that he didn't want to direct, he just found that film particularly tough, and he's admitted that in interviews. But when he decided that he wanted to tell the story that would become In America, first of all, it was called East of Harlem in its early drafts, and he turned to his two daughters, Naomi and Kirsten, who at that point were in their teens, and he figured that the story he wanted to tell was their story too, and so he asked them to write their stories for the film. He was going to co-write this film with them, and so the pair of them, he basically commissioned his daughters to write that screenplay. It was their voice and insight that he wanted. He thought that was vital to it. And so what Kirsten and Naomi Sheridan did was they worked separately and put their material together, and over time they were able to pull together the key things that mattered the most to each of the people in the midst of this story. It was a few years later when he gave the story a little bit of a twist, because in his own background there's the tragic story of him losing his younger brother Frankie at the age of 10, and he wanted to weave that feeling of loss of losing a young child into the film as well, because that's part and parcel wrapped up in his life. That's his memories, and this was, of course, this was going to be his and his daughter's life story. And so Sheridan would tell American Heritage magazine in an interview that, quote, "The film is ultimately about wonder, that it's about trying to see the world with a kind of childlike quality. It's a view of Manhattan as an island of dreams that helps a family rediscover its bonds." And so that's once he got all the memories together, he wove that story in of Frankie, and he made Frankie the child of the two lead characters in the film, Johnny and Sarah, and so thus they come to America haunted by the loss of their young son in the film. The family unit we thus see in the film is Johnny and Sarah as the mum and dad, and Christy and Ariel, the two daughters, but they're all dealing and trying to process this loss. That's the background of their lives. And in an interview with Today, it was Kirsten Sheridan admitted that when her dad wove that in, that she and her sister stepped back. She said, quote, "I knew that was the heart and soul of the film, and that's my dad's heart and soul." And so even though they went backwards and forwards on various elements and memories of the film, they did dispute, say for instance their dad's version of things that had gone on, that they knew that was his bit of the story, and they stepped back and he put that heart into the midst of the film. But as his eldest daughter said to him via an IndieWire interview, it's just like, of course he prefers those kids over real kids because he can rewrite them when it came to the writing of the daughters in the film. And Sheridan's been fairly open about with the movie that he'd taken liberties with the story, not least because they moved the timeline for a start, that the film takes place in the 1990s. It was contemporary at the point that it was made. Originally, the idea was to set the film in 1982, but budget cuts had reduced the spend that was available for the movie. They wanted to tie it to the year E.T. was released. And also by moving it to the 90s, what it then meant was the art department didn't have to run around New York changing license plates on cars and such like. And they also introduced giving one of the characters a camcorder to capture their experiences. So they worked with the slight change of time, and they also worked with the slight change of events and character. He did at one stage get pushback from studio executives who argued that he should be setting the film in Los Angeles rather than New York, but he needed it to be New York. That was the grounding of the story. And in fact, when the film did shoot in the summer of 2001, it did shoot in New York City, and then it shot in Ireland as well. There was the casting to get on top of, though, before they could get to that shooting process. At first, the lead roles, well, there was talk of Ewan McGregor and Kate Winslet taking those roles on, but ultimately Jim Sheridan settled on the brilliant pairing of Paddy Considine and Samantha Morton. Now, he didn't do auditions. That he looked at their other work, and he cast people based on what he saw. And I know in the case of Considine, he said that it was a room for Romeo Brass that led him to casting Considine in the film. And Sheridan admits that he can be I'm not sure it's quite controlling, but he knows what he wants from actors, and he likes working with really skilled actors who really bring an awful lot to the films, as you would expect. I mean, just look at the people that he's worked with in the past. Daniel Day-Lewis, Brenda Fricker, he's directed to Oscars, for instance. But this film also hinged on the two young daughters in the story, Christy and Ariel, and casting the young sisters was quite tricky, and to the point where he talked in the end in an interview with the Irish Times about this, because in the end he cast the sisters Sarah and Emma Bolger, who are quite brilliant in the roles. And to quote the interview, he said, I went into the audition room, there were 10 kids there, the first batch. I looked around and I saw this kid, Emma, so that's Emma Bolger, and he said, I just, whoa, and instinctively handed her the script. She read it and I thought, she's good, but maybe she's a bit too good, maybe too self-confident. I gave it to another kid to read, and then I felt my jacket being literally yanked, and I turned around and it was Emma just looking at me. It was like I'd crossed some line of etiquette, and she looked at me with pity and said, is she reading my part? So I tried to stare her out and it didn't work. She just kept focused. So I realised this kid has self-esteem, which is important. So I said, no, nobody's reading your part and you're cast. And so he didn't really audition the other 200 kids who were there. That he instinctively tapped into, saw something in her, and the casting was, well, just astonishing, really. And it was Emma who then said, well, my sister's in the car as well. And that's how Emma and Sarah got cast in those crucial roles in the film, and just did really incredible jobs. Now, it should be noted that the film did evolve as it was being written, as you'd expect, but also as it was being filmed. That in the summer of 2001, it was shooting. Of course, the horrific attacks in New York on September the 11th happened in that year, at the point where In America was filming in Dublin. At that point, it wasn't doing its New York shooting, and so it evolved a little off the back of that as well. Sheridan did say he found directing the young actors a challenge, not just because they were channeling his daughters, but also he couldn't quite work out what they were doing. That as I said, he liked to know where he was with actors, and he let the young performers follow their instinct, but made sure he had a take for himself. But more often than not, he went with the take where they followed their instinct. In terms of just getting the look of the film right as well, I mean, he credits Declan Quinn on the lighting side with giving it a bit of a warmer, a magical look than you might ordinarily expect from a Jim Sheridan movie at that point. And there was also a consciousness, really, that 3 of the 4 characters in the movie are the main characters in the movie are based on the film's screenwriters. So one of those situations where it's quite an odd film, I would imagine, to shoot at that point. But shoot it he did, and the film wrapped production in 2000, in the autumn of 2001, and then it came the challenge of how do you get a smaller production noticed in the midst of all the blockbuster fare. The answer, of course, is the film festival circuit, and so In America premiered at the Toronto International Film Festival on the 12th of September 2002, so it was under a year after production had finished. And I mean, lots of things were praised. Declan Quinn's cinematography, the screenplay from Jim Naomi and Kirsten Sheridan that would ultimately earn them Oscar nominations. And whilst there's a little bit of pushback, most people tend to be very, very warm to the movie. And I for one, love it, as I think I've been fairly clear about. Interestingly, just to get it to Toronto, it wasn't quite finished. I mean, the print was pretty much wet coming from the lab at that point. The credits weren't on, the closing song wasn't in place, but the response was strong. strong. And off the back of that, the studio, it's a Fox Searchlight film, and they'd picked up the movie. They were going to distribute it pretty much around the world. And so it originally was looking at a release in May 2003, but it was Sheridan who was resistant to that, because he didn't think that the film, by now called In America, was a summer movie at all. He didn't think people wanted to go out in the middle of the summer to watch a film that would tug at their heartstrings, make them laugh a little bit, make them perhaps feel warm inside. They're after more blockbuster fare at that time of the year. And ultimately Fox went along with his wishes on that. So the film would be released in the UK on the 31st of October 2003. It would then make it to America in November 2003. It was a modest success that the movie would gross $25 million worldwide. I mean, it was never going to top the box office. In America, it opened the same day as Eddie Murphy in The Haunted Mansion, if you want some context there. And it followed the almost the independent model of releasing a film that you open on a small number of screens and look to build up word of mouth over a period of time. And that's pretty much what happened. The word of mouth did grow. I don't know the budget of this particular movie. I can't imagine it's an awful lot. But that 25 million isn't really a bad return for it. It also attracted Oscar attention, and in fact it picked up quite a lot of independent film awards around the year, and independent film and Golden Globe nominations and Independent Spirit nominations and British Independent Film Award nominations. But crucially, for the profile of the film, Samantha Morton was nominated for Best Actress, Shimon Honsu was nominated for Best Supporting Actor, and Jim Sheridan, Naomi Sheridan and Kirsten Sheridan, as I mentioned before, got a Best Original Screenplay Oscar nomination as well. They didn't win those awards, but the profile certainly helped. But nonetheless, Sheridan was already putting in the miles promoting the film, because this was a case of a director who felt he had to do what he would ask his actors to do in this situation. And so he went around America doing an extensive number of Q&As in big and small locations to promote the film. You know, this was his most personal film, and he wanted to go out on the road to give it a push, which is what he duly did. Over time, I do fear a film like In America just falls into the background a little bit, and it's such a delightful movie, just awaiting discovery. I do think the performances of Constantine Morton and the two Walters are just exceptional in the film, and I really do urge you to seek it out if you've not done so already. Also, of course, there's never any chance or desire or requirement for a film like this to have any kind of sequel, but nonetheless there was talk of a TV series take on the whole story about 4 or 5 years ago. That just seems to have petered out just a little bit. Nonetheless, even though there's not a brilliant Blu-ray release or anything like that of In America, it is a film really worth seeking out. I know some people just push back a little bit against it. They just don't quite buy it. I really do. I think it's great, and I hugely commend the movie to you. And that brings to the end the latest episode of Film Stories. You can find me on Twitter at Simon Brew. You can find the entire Film Stories project on Twitter at Film Stories Pod, where you can find video Film Stories exclusive to our YouTube channel at youtube.com/Film Stories. We're on Facebook as well, facebook.com/Film Stories online. And I'm continuing taking my one-man movie nerd show out and about around the country. The next gig makes it sound really posh, doesn't it? Is in Belfast on the 17th of October. You can find details of everything related to Film Stories, as well as a whole host of daily news stories and features as well, over at the website www.filmstories.co.uk. But for this episode of Film Stories, we're done and dusted. And as always, I thank you so much for your support. I thank you so much for listening, and I'll be back in your eardrums soon with another bunch of Film Stories. You all take care. Bye bye.